The night Marshal Daniel Cross arrived in Silver Creek, the blood moon hung low over the mountains like an omen written in crimson fire. By dawn, 7 people would be dead, a town would be in flames, and Daniel would be forced to choose between his badge and his soul. What he didn't know was that the choice had already been made for him 20 years ago by a promise he'd forgotten, and a debt that demanded payment in blood. The stagecoach had broken down 3 miles outside of town, forcing Daniel to walk the final stretch through territory that belonged more to wolves than men. His boots crunched on frost-covered ground as he made his way down the mountain trail, each step echoing like a gunshot in the thin air. Above him, the blood moon cast everything in shades of red and shadow, turning the familiar into the nightmarish. Silver Creek sprawled in the valley below like a wound in the earth, its buildings dark except for the occasional flicker of lamplight. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, carrying the scents of wood fire and cooking food, the normal smells of civilization trying to take root in wilderness. But there was something else on the wind, something that made Daniel's hand drift instinctively to his gun. The smell of fear. Daniel had learned to recognize it during 20 years of wearing a badge, 20 years of walking into towns where good people were afraid to sleep at night. It was a sour, acrid scent that seemed to permeate everything, seeping into wood and stone and the very souls of decent folk who had been pushed too far by men who mistook cruelty for strength. The telegram that had summoned him to Silver Creek was unlike any he'd ever received. No signature, no official seal, just 4 words that had haunted him for the past 3 days. The Covenant demands payment. It was signed with a symbol he recognized from a nightmare he'd spent 20 years trying to forget, a wolf's head surrounded by 13 stars. The Order of the Wolf. Daniel had hoped they were all dead, scattered to the winds after the war ended, and their cause crumbled into dust. But apparently, some shadows from the past were too dark to be banished by time alone. As he approached the town's outskirts, Daniel noticed the absence of the usual sounds that marked a frontier settlement at night. No drunken laughter from saloons, no piano music drifting through batwing doors, no arguments or conversations or signs of normal human activity. Silver Creek was silent as a tomb, and about as welcoming. The first building he came to was the livery stable, its doors hanging open like a mouth frozen in a scream. Daniel approached cautiously, his Colt .45 loose in its holster. Inside, he found the stable master hanging from a roof beam, his body swaying gently in the breeze that whistled through gaps in walls. Pinned to the dead man's shirt was a note written in the same hand as the telegram, 1 down, 13 to go. The Covenant remembers. Daniel cut the body down and examined the note more closely. The paper was expensive, the kind used by wealthy men who wanted to make impressions. The ink was fresh, no more than a few hours old. Whoever had done this was still in town, still carrying out whatever twisted plan had brought Daniel to Silver Creek. But why Silver Creek? What connection did this remote mining town have to the Order of the Wolf, a secret organization that had died with the Confederacy? And why had they summoned him specifically to witness whatever horror they were orchestrating? The answer, when it came to him, hit like a physical blow. 20 years ago, during the final days of the war, Daniel had been part of a Union patrol that had discovered the Order's headquarters in a burned-out plantation house outside of Richmond. 13 men had been captured that night, all of them high-ranking Confederate officers who had sworn a blood oath to continue the war by other means. Daniel remembered the trials, remembered the testimonies about plans to assassinate Union officials, to burn northern cities, to spread terror and chaos long after Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. 12 of the 13 had been hanged as traitors and war criminals. But the 13th had escaped. Colonel Marcus Blackthorne, the Order's founder and leader, had vanished during the confusion of the trials. Rumors placed him everywhere from Mexico to Montana, but no one had ever found concrete proof of his survival. Daniel had assumed that time and age had claimed him, that whatever threat the Order represented had died with its leadership. Apparently, he'd been wrong. Daniel made his way deeper into Silver Creek, his senses alert for any sign of movement or ambush. The main street was eerily empty, lined with buildings that seemed to watch him with dark window eyes. A saloon, a general store, a hotel, a church, all the structures that marked a town's attempt to impose civilization on the wilderness. But civilization was fragile in places like Silver Creek, and it didn't take much to tear away the veneer and reveal the savagery beneath. The hotel's front door stood ajar, lamplight spilling out onto the wooden sidewalk. Daniel approached carefully, noting the absence of sound from within. No conversations, no footsteps, no signs of the normal activity that should mark a frontier hotel at night. Inside, he found the second body. The hotel clerk lay behind his desk, a bullet hole in his forehead, and another note pinned to his vest. This one read, 2 down, 12 to go. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Daniel was beginning to see the pattern. Someone was working their way through a list, killing people according to some predetermined plan. But what connected a stable master and a hotel clerk to events from 20 years ago? What made them targets worthy of the order's attention? A sound from upstairs, a floorboard creaking under someone's weight, made Daniel freeze. He wasn't alone in the hotel, and whoever was up there was trying to move quietly. Daniel drew his gun and started up the stairs, placing each foot carefully to minimize noise. The second floor hallway stretched before him like a tunnel leading to hell. Doors lined both sides, most of them closed, but one at the far end stood open. Lamplight flickered from within, casting dancing shadows on the hallway walls. Daniel approached the open door with the patience of a hunter who had learned that haste usually meant death. Inside, he could see a figure sitting in a chair by the window, silhouetted against the blood-red moonlight. "Come in, Marshal Cross," a voice called softly. "I've been waiting for you." Daniel stepped into the room, his gun trained on the figure by the window. As his eyes adjusted to the light, he realized he was looking at a woman probably in her 30s, with dark hair and the kind of beauty that suggested both strength and vulnerability. But it was her eyes that made his breath catch. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much death, who had been forced to make choices that no one should ever have to make. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, keeping his gun steady. "My name is Elena Blackthorne," she said quietly, "and I'm here to stop my father from destroying what's left of my life." The name hit Daniel like a thunderbolt. Blackthorne, Colonel Marcus Blackthorne's daughter, which meant she was the child of the most wanted war criminal in 3 territories. But she was also, apparently, trying to stop him. "Your father is here?" Daniel asked. Elena nodded toward the window. "He's been in Silver Creek for 3 days, carrying out what he calls a final reckoning. He believes that justice was never served for the Order's members who died, and he's determined to extract payment from those he holds responsible." "The stable master and the hotel clerk weren't responsible for anything," Daniel protested. "They were probably children during the war." "Amma Asselsock Edisai Olin say." Elena's voice carried a sadness that seemed to age her before Daniel's eyes. "They weren't chosen for what they did during the war. They were chosen for what their fathers did." The implication was staggering. Colonel Blackthorne wasn't just seeking revenge against those who had wronged him directly. He was visiting the sins of the fathers upon their children, carrying out a twisted form of generational justice that made innocents pay for crimes they had never committed. The stablemaster's father was Captain Samuel Morrison, the Union officer who led the raid on our headquarters, Elena continued. The hotel clerk was the son of Judge William Hayes, who presided over the trials. My father has a list of 13 names, all descendants of the men he holds responsible for the Order's destruction. Daniel felt the pieces clicking into place like the chambers of a revolver being loaded. "And I'm on that list." "You're not just on the list, Marshal. You're the primary target. My father has never forgotten that you were the one who provided the testimony that sealed the Order's fate. He saved you for last, after he's made you watch the consequences of your actions." The cold calculation of it was breathtaking in its cruelty. Blackthorne could have killed Daniel at any time over the past 20 years, but instead he had waited, planned, orchestrated this elaborate revenge that would force Daniel to witness the deaths of innocents before claiming his own life. "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel asked. "Why help me stop your own father?" Elena stood and moved to the window, staring out at the blood moon with eyes that seemed to hold their own internal darkness. "Because I've spent 20 years watching him transform from a soldier into a monster. Because I've seen what his obsession with revenge has cost, not just his enemies, but everyone around him." She turned back to Daniel, and in the lamplight, he could see tears tracking down her cheeks. "Because I was married once, Marshal, to a good man who tried to help my father find peace. And 3 months ago, my husband made the mistake of suggesting that maybe it was time to let the past die." Daniel didn't need to ask what had happened to her husband. The pain in Elena's voice told the story more clearly than words ever could. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Save your sympathy for the people who are still alive," Elena replied. "Because if we don't stop him tonight, 11 more innocents are going to die before dawn." A sound from downstairs, boots on wooden floors, announced the arrival of new players in their deadly drama. Daniel moved to the window and saw figures moving through the shadows on the street below. At least 6 men, all armed, all moving with the disciplined coordination of military veterans. His followers, Elena whispered. Men who served under him during the war and never accepted that it ended. They've been living in the mountains for 20 years, planning for this night. Daniel counted the odds and didn't like what he saw. 6 armed men, possibly more, led by a colonel who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. Against that, he had himself, his gun, and a woman whose loyalties were still questionable despite her apparent desire to stop her father. "Where are the rest of the townspeople?" he asked. "Locked in the church," Elena replied. "My father wants witnesses to what he calls his final victory over the Union forces that destroyed his life." Which meant that Daniel had more than just his own life to consider. Innocent people were depending on him to stop a madman's revenge, and failure wasn't an option. Istambiu noctada hersei digisti. The sound of boots on the hotel's stairs announced that their private conversation was over. Daniel moved away from the window, positioning himself where he could cover the door while keeping Elena in sight. He still wasn't entirely sure he trusted her, but for now, they seemed to share a common enemy. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and a voice Daniel recognized from 20-year-old nightmares called out, "Marshal Cross, I know you're in there. Come out, and we can discuss this like civilized men." Colonel Marcus Blackthorne sounded older than Daniel remembered, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades spent nursing grievances and planning revenge. But there was still steel in it, still the authority of a man who had commanded other men in battle. "Colonel," Daniel called back, "I think we're past the point of civilized discussion." Blackthorne's laugh was like broken glass grinding underfoot. "Perhaps. But surely we can spare a moment for old time's sake? After all, it's been 20 years since you destroyed everything I held dear." "I was doing my job," Daniel replied. "Upholding the law, protecting innocent people from men who wanted to continue a war that had already claimed too many lives." "Innocent people," Blackthorne repeated mockingly. "Like the stable master whose father burned down churches with Confederate families inside? Like the hotel clerk whose father sentenced Confederate prisoners to hang without trial? Tell me, Marshal, where was your precious law when Union forces were committing war crimes?" Daniel had heard these arguments before, the endless cycle of justifications that men use to excuse their own brutality by pointing to the brutality of others. It was the logic of vendetta, of blood feud, of a justice that recognized no limits and accepted no endings. 2 wrongs don't make a right, Colonel. They just make more wrongs. Durber dakika, bu dete kasurma. Elena spoke quietly, but her words cut through the conversation like a blade. "Father, you're talking to the wrong man about war crimes." The silence that followed was profound, loaded with implications that Daniel couldn't quite grasp. But Blackthorne's response, when it came, was sharp with sudden anger. "Elena, what are you doing here?" "Trying to save what's left of our family's honor," she replied, moving toward the door. "Trying to stop you from becoming the very thing you once fought against." "You don't understand," Blackthorne said, his voice carrying a note of desperation that hadn't been there before. "This isn't about revenge. This is about justice. This is about making sure that the sacrifices of good men weren't meaningless." Elena opened the door and stepped into the hallway, facing her father across a distance that seemed to measure more than just physical space. Daniel could see Blackthorne now, and the years had not been kind to him. He was still tall and commanding, but his hair was white as winter snow, and his face was carved deep with lines of bitterness and loss. Behind him stood 5 men in Confederate gray uniforms that had seen better decades. They were older now, grizzled veterans who had never learned to let go of old wars, but their weapons were clean, and their eyes were alert. "Justice." Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You call murdering innocent people justice? You call terrorizing a town full of families justice?" "I call it payment for debts that have gone too long uncollected," Blackthorne replied firmly. "These people's fathers took everything from us, Elena. Our cause, our comrades, our way of life. They destroyed the order and scattered us to the winds like criminals." "Because you were criminals," Daniel interjected, stepping into the hallway beside Elena. "The order wasn't fighting for Southern independence anymore. You were planning to assassinate civilians, to burn northern cities, to spread terror for its own sake." Blackthorne's eyes fixed on Daniel with the intensity of a rattlesnake preparing to strike. "Marshal Cross, You look older. 20 years of serving your precious Union seems to have aged you. 20 years of keeping the peace tends to do that, Daniel replied evenly. 20 years of choosing to build instead of destroy. And what have you built? Blackthorn asked mockingly. A West where might makes right, where the strong prey on the weak, where justice is whatever the man with the biggest gun says it is. Tell me, Marshal, how is that different from what the order represented? It was a fair question, and Daniel had to admit that the frontier could be a brutal place where law was often enforced at gunpoint. But there was a difference between using violence to protect the innocent and using it to terrorize them. The difference, Daniel said carefully, is that I use my gun to protect people who can't protect themselves. You use yours to punish people for their father's sins. Hina zen bayak surprise gormadin. Blackthorn smiled, but it was the expression of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Marshal, do you remember Captain James Morrison, the Union officer who led the raid on our headquarters? I remember him. Do you remember what he did to the civilians we were protecting? The women and children who had taken shelter in our compound? Daniel frowned. The official reports had mentioned no civilians in the Confederate stronghold, only military personnel and weapons stockpiles. But something in Blackthorn's voice suggested there was more to the story. There were no civilians reported, Daniel said slowly. Because Captain Morrison ordered them killed and their bodies burned, Blackthorn snarled. 17 women and children murdered in cold blood to prevent them from testifying about what they had seen. And you, Marshal Cross, helped cover it up by failing to investigate the discrepancies in the casualty reports. The accusation hit Daniel like a physical blow. If it were true, then his testimony hadn't just led to the execution of war criminals, it had helped cover up the massacre of innocents. But was it true, or was this just another manipulation by a man who had spent 20 years crafting the perfect revenge? Elena stepped between her father and Daniel, her face pale but determined. Even if that's true, Father, it doesn't justify what you're doing now. Killing innocent people won't bring back the dead from 20 years ago. Won't it? Blackthorn asked, his voice soft with madness barely held in check. Won't their deaths serve as payment for the innocents who died unavenged? Won't their families understand finally what it means to lose everything to the arbitrary justice of their enemies? Daniel realized that he was dealing with a man who had moved far beyond rational argument into the realm of obsession and insanity. Blackthorn wasn't seeking justice anymore. He was seeking a kind of cosmic balance, a settling of accounts that would somehow make sense of 20 years of loss and grief. But cosmic balance built on innocent blood was just another word for evil. Colonel, Daniel said quietly, I can't let you hurt these people. You can't stop me, Blackthorn replied with absolute certainty. Even if you kill me, my men will carry out the plan. The 13 deaths will be completed, the debt will be paid, and the order will finally rest in peace. Simdi Gordukler and Hickber say. Elena pulled a small derringer from her dress pocket, its barrel gleaming in the lamplight. But instead of pointing it at Daniel or her father's men, she pressed it against her own temple. Then I'll be the 13th death, she said calmly. I'll pay the debt with my own blood, and you can live with the knowledge that your obsession with revenge cost you the only family you had left. The silence that followed was absolute. Blackthorn stared at his daughter with eyes that suddenly seemed to see her clearly for the first time in years. Behind him, his followers shifted nervously, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected development. Elena, Blackthorn whispered, what are you doing? I'm choosing to die for something meaningful instead of living for something meaningless, she replied. I'm choosing to save innocent lives instead of taking them. I'm choosing to end this cycle of violence instead of perpetuating it. Daniel could see the calculation in her eyes, the desperate gamble of a woman who was betting everything on the slim hope that her father still loved her more than he hated his enemies. It was brave beyond words and probably doomed to failure, but gave Daniel the opening he needed. While Blackthorn was focused on his daughter, Daniel drew his Colt .45 and put a bullet through the nearest Confederate veteran's chest. The man dropped without a sound, his own weapon clattering to the floor. The other spun toward Daniel, but he was already moving, rolling behind the protection of a heavy wooden dresser as return fire splintered the wall above his head. Elena used the confusion to tackle her father, driving him to the floor and sending his gun skittering across the hallway. But two of his men had clear shots at Daniel's position, and their rifle bullets were chewing chunks out of his makeshift cover. Daniel counted rounds, waited for a pause in the firing, then rolled out into the hallway with his gun blazing. 2 more Confederate veterans went down, but not before one of them got a bullet into Daniel's left shoulder. The impact spun him around and slammed him against the wall, red-hot pain flooding through his arm. But he was still alive, still fighting, and now the odds were almost even. Blackthorn had regained his feet and was struggling with Elena for control of her Derringer. The remaining 2 Confederate veterans were trying to get clear shots at Daniel without hitting their leader's daughter. In the chaos and confusion, nobody had a clear advantage. Then Daniel heard a sound that changed everything. The church bell was ringing, not with the measured tolls of a call to worship, but with the frantic clanging of an alarm. Someone in town was awake. Someone was spreading the warning that Silver Creek was under attack. The townspeople, Elena gasped, still fighting with her father. They're free. Blackthorn's face twisted with rage. Impossible. I had them locked in the church under guard. Inameakaxan AMA. Daniel smiled through his pain, understanding flooding through him. You made the same mistake every military commander makes when dealing with civilians, Colonel. You assumed they wouldn't fight back. The sound of running feet on the street below, voices calling out in alarm and anger, confirmed Daniel's assessment. The people of Silver Creek had broken free of their captivity and were organizing a response to the threat that had terrorized their town, which meant that Blackthorn's carefully orchestrated revenge was falling apart. His plan had depended on controlling the situation, on being able to carry out his executions methodically and without interference. But civilian populations, even frightened ones, were notoriously difficult to control for extended periods. It's over, Colonel, Daniel said, keeping his gun trained. On the remaining Confederate veterans. Your men are outnumbered, your plan is compromised, and your daughter is right. This won't bring back the dead or heal the wounds of the past. Blackthorn looked around at the hallway littered with bodies, at his daughter, whose eyes held nothing but sorrow and disappointment, at the marshal who had spent 20 years as the focus of his hatred. For a moment, Daniel thought he saw something human flicker in the old soldier's eyes. But then the shutters came down again, and Blackthorn was once more the cold, calculating killer who had spent 2 decades planning this night. Perhaps you're right, Marshal, he said quietly. Perhaps this won't heal the past, but it will end it. Before Daniel could react, Blackthorn pulled a stick of dynamite from his coat and lit the fuse with a match he struck against the wall. The sputtering flame cast dancing shadows as he held the explosive high. 10 seconds, Marshal. Enough time to think about all the innocents who died because of your testimony, all the families destroyed because you chose to serve a corrupt system rather than stand up for what was right. Elena screamed and threw herself at her father, trying to wrestle the dynamite from his grip. But Blackthorn was stronger, and 20 years of hatred had given him strength beyond the merely physical. Daniel had perhaps 5 seconds to make a choice that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. He could try to shoot Blackthorn, but the explosion would still kill Elena and probably bring down the hotel. He could try to get the dynamite away from a colonel, but that would mean leaving cover and exposing himself to the remaining Confederate veterans. Or he could do what 20 years of wearing a badge had taught him was sometimes necessary, sacrifice himself to save others. Daniel threw himself down the hallway toward Blackthorn, firing as he ran. His bullets took out the 2 remaining Confederate veterans, but their return fire caught him in the chest and leg, sending him tumbling across the floor in a spray of blood. But his momentum carried him into Blackthorn just as the colonel was preparing to throw the dynamite down the stairwell toward the hotel's first floor. The impact knocked both men through the window and out into the night air, 3 stories above Silver Creek's Main Street. Time seemed to slow as they fell, the blood moon hanging above them like an eye witnessing their final moments. Daniel felt the dynamite slip from Blackthorn's grip, saw it spinning away into the darkness below where townspeople were gathering with torches and weapons. Then they hit the wooden sidewalk with an impact that drove the breath from Daniel's lungs and sent waves of agony through his already wounded body. Beside him, Colonel Marcus Blackthorn lay motionless, his neck bent at an angle that suggested their long conflict had finally reached its end. The dynamite exploded somewhere down the street, the sound rolling through the canyon like thunder. But it was far enough away that the blast only shattered windows instead of lives, only damaged property instead of destroying families. Daniel tried to sit up and found that his body wasn't responding the way it should. Blood was pooling beneath him, dark and warm, and each breath sent fresh waves of pain through his chest. He was dying, probably had been since the moment he'd taken those bullets in the hallway. But he was alive long enough to see Elena Blackthorne climb down from a hotel's second floor, alive long enough to see the townspeople of Silver Creek emerge from hiding to reclaim their streets, alive long enough to know that his sacrifice had meant something. Elena knelt beside him, her face streaked with tears and dust. "Marshal Cross, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. If I had stopped him sooner, if I had been stronger." "You did everything you could," Daniel whispered, surprised at how difficult it was becoming to speak. "You chose the right side when it mattered most." "What should I tell them about my father?" she asked, gesturing toward the gathering crowd. "How do I explain what he became?" Daniel thought about it, drawing on 20 years of experience with the complexities of human nature, 20 years of learning that people were capable of both great good and great evil, sometimes within the span of a single day. "Tell them he was a soldier who never learned that the war was over," he said finally. "Tell them he was a man who loved his comrades so much that he forgot how to love anything else. Tell them he was human, with all the nobility and tragedy that implies." Elena nodded, understanding that mercy toward the dead was sometimes the first step toward healing for the living. The crowd was gathering around them now, townspeople who had lived in terror for 3 days and were only now beginning to understand that their nightmare was over. Daniel could see relief and gratitude in their faces, but also the recognition that freedom often came at a terrible price. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town physician and son of the judge who had presided over the Confederate trials, pushed through the crowd and knelt beside Daniel. His examination was brief but thorough, and the look in his eyes told Daniel everything he needed to know about his prognosis. "Is there anything I can do to make you more comfortable?" Dr. Hayes asked quietly. Daniel managed a smile. "Just make sure the story gets told right. Make sure people understand that violence begets violence, that hatred passed down through generations only grows stronger with time." "I'll make sure," Dr. Hayes promised. As the blood moon began to set behind the mountains and the first pale light of dawn touched the peaks, Daniel Cross felt his life ebbing away like water flowing downstream. He had spent 20 years serving the law, protecting the innocent, trying to build something better than what had come before. Whether he had succeeded was for others to judge. But as he lay dying in the street of a town he had helped to save, surrounded by people who were alive because of his sacrifice, Daniel thought maybe his life had been worth something after all. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Elena Blackthorne placing his marshal's badge carefully on his chest, her face wet with tears for a man she had known for only a few hours, but who had shown her what it meant to choose duty over self-preservation. The blood moon set over Silver Creek, taking with it the ghosts of old wars and older hatreds. In its place, the clean light of morning began to spread across the mountains, promising new beginnings for a town that had learned the difference between justice and revenge. And somewhere in the growing light, the spirit of Marshal Daniel Cross rode on, carrying with it the eternal hope that good men and women would always be willing to stand between civilization and chaos, regardless of the personal cost. The story of Silver Creek was over, but the story of justice in the American West continued, written in blood and sacrifice by those who believed that some things were worth dying for. That, as they say, is the most important story of all.